Okay. Now let's get on with the second part, and in this part we will be talking, I'm saying we, but it is of course I who will be talking and you who will be watching. And I still have this strange feeling I should apologize for dropping that much information onto you in each of these videos. But alas, let me go on. Now, the term sitcom can be defined in various ways. Jeremy Butler, for instance, has framed the sitcom more broadly, encompassing all half-hour comedies that base their humor in narrative situations. Thus, including also all situational comedies which features short, isolated verbal and physical gags, but also tell us a story that is not only center stage, but mainly amuses audiences through the predicaments of the characters and their dialogue. However, the more traditional definition of sitcom frames sitcoms as short narrative comedies, usually between 24 to 30 minutes, with recurring characters and settings in each episode. This, as Larry Mintz argues, means that each week we encounter the same people in essentially the same setting. The episodes are finite. What happens in a given episode is usually closed off, explained, reconciled, solved at the end of half an hour. Sitcoms are generally performed before live audiences, whether broadcast live in the old days or filmed or taped, and they usually have an element that might almost be a metadrama in the sense that since the laughter is recorded, sometimes even augmented, the audience is aware of watching a play, a performance, a comedy incorporating comic activity. The most important feature of sitcom structure is the cyclical nature of the normalcy of the premise undergoing stress or threat of change and becoming restored. This faculty for the happy ending is of course one of the staples of comedy, according to most comic theory. In a British context, sitcoms, or more appropriately Britcoms, are additionally shaped by the specific dynamics of British television industry, nationally inflected narrative traditions, and specifically British issues. And while Mintz's definition seems rather comprehensive, presenting a rather stable definition of the genre, his definition could very well be used for other genres also. In fact, Brett Mills has argued that trying to produce an unarguable dictionary definition of a genre is very difficult, as their defining features and conventions are mostly based on an agreement amongst filmmakers, reviewers, and audiences. Apart from narrative conventions, visual presentation, colors, and light can also be seen as indicative of a certain genre, as well as the choice of props, objects, music, or actors. It is this repertoire of elements, however, that makes a classification or the practices that categorize the text actually possible in the first place. As such, Mintz's definition does have its merits. Rather, its three main aspects, namely setting, aesthetics, and narrative structure, do have merit and may be used to distinguish the sitcom from other series, as well as render it worth analyzing. The sitcom harks back to a very long tradition of circulation, ranging from sketches printed in newspapers to situation comedy sketches on the radio, before making its way onto television screens. On television, moreover, it has not only been seen as the longest-lived narrative genre, which has outpaced, for instance, soap operas, crime dramas, and other genres, but also as a remarkably stable genre which is unlikely to change the set of characteristics Larry Mintz has described before. Even in a day and age in which broadcasting mechanisms have started to shift towards more on-demand services and potential on-repeat binge-watching on streaming services, sitcoms have yet to change its core characteristics, a stability which, according to Jeremy Butler, might be one of the reasons for the genre's continuous popularity and longevity. Notably, however, a factor that Mintz in his description of the architecture of the sitcom misses is, and this should be not surprising to you, its focus on domesticity. Sitcoms, both in their earliest forms and nowadays, seek to address the everyday of usually middle-class families, in that its plots are centered around situations with which the average reader or viewer is actually familiar. House cleaning, catching a train, illness, whitewashing the cellar or fence, moving furniture, reducing the gas bill, quit smoking, and dozens of purely domestic situations. This has led to some scholars arguing that the representation of domestic scenes in particular television programs is to do with the space for which such programs are usually produced and the spaces in which these programs are usually consumed in, that is, the domestic sphere. Yet this focus has also been seen as a contributing factor to the genre being seen as small time, portraying small events and recognizable stock social situations, rather than big issues that are the staple diet of high-budget dramas, documentaries, and news. Mills notes that small time has, however, various illusions, of which the focus on the domestic issues is only one. Small time may also refer to the nature of the industry that produces it, which he describes as a cottage industry that has small production values and small returns. But it could also refer to its social value, which is first and foremost to serve as an alternative to work, education, and seriousness, or to the lack of artistry in the genre, a sense that the sitcom is rarely groundbreaking or experimental and has instead behaved itself, pursuing a repetitive set of aesthetics and ideologies for decades. The latter point is furthermore emphasized by the sitcom being produced for entertainment purposes rather than as an educational or informational tool. As noted in previous videos, entertainment has been largely regarded as a somewhat lesser cultural form, as entertainment is generally seen as an endpoint to discourse, simply offering pleasures which rarely question society and social norms. Entertainment thus seems absolutely incompatible with critical thinking or rigorous analysis. Indeed, as Brett Mills has argued, sitcoms might be good entertainment because they precisely do not require us to think. In fact, the sitcom might be seen as a worthwhile escapism after a hard day at work, but it is overall nothing more than a diverting amusement that, as a rule, one does not talk about. As such, sitcoms, whose primary aim is to be funny, have been to an extent sidelined in academic research due to their entertainment factor. Their X factor. Is that the E factor, not the X factor? Anyhow, while the situation of the sitcom has been examined extensively, its entertainment value, or as Brett Mills puts it, its comic impetus. And here a brief side note on the question of comic relief and tragic relief. That is that while comic relief might be a staple of tragic theatre, a tragic relief can be seen as equally important to comedy, performing roughly the same function as its counterpart, in that it doesn't undermine or destroy the comic impetus of the sitcom, but instead it helps to reassert and define the comic impetus precisely by being a respite from the ceaselessness of the comedy. Has been largely marginalized in the analysis of the genre. Yet the sitcom, like few other genres, is characterized by its humorous content, and audiences come to it with the expectation of laughter, with programs employing a wide range of elements such as the inclusion of canned laughter that clearly signal humor and aim to make that funniness even more funny and more powerful. However, that comedy is one of its defining features does not mean that the sitcom is throughout absolutely funny all the time. While it of course includes dramatic or serious elements like death, grief, etc., it cannot shy away from the comic for too long, as dwelling on other elements for too long might change the sitcom into a markedly different genre altogether. As such, these elements, while decidedly not funny themselves, are, and to an extent need to be, either delivered via the comic mode, or they're allowed because they offer a brief respite from the program's comic impetus. While such considerations, the small-time nature, the domesticity, the recurring stock social situations, as well as the comedy, might render the sitcom seemingly unsuitable to analysis in regards to important issues, Francis Bonner has argued in Ordinary Television that the majority of programs that constitute broadcasting are actually small-time and mundane. Indeed, Bonner has made the argument that the ordinariness of the sitcom is in fact its strongest suit, as the consumption in the domestic sphere powerfully drives the communicative style and manner of broadcasting to approximate to the norms not only of public forms of talk, but to those of ordinary familiar conversation, for this is overwhelmingly the preferred communicative style of interaction between people in the routine contexts of day-to-day life. As such, the sitcom may become a constitutive part of the familial or the domestic relations through which we conduct our lives, as it is incorporated into the flows of everyday domestic life. This also means that television often goes out of its way to fit into the lives of its viewers, generally giving both television and the sitcom the appearance of simplicity when it is actually a highly complex and multifarious genre made up of a range of programs produced by a very complex industrial system and consumed by audiences in a variety of ways. While repetition, along with routine, has been noted as one of the most difficult problems facing us, Frank Calliter questions this idea and asks, what is culture if not a realm of repetition and variation? A question that could very well adapt it to television and the sitcom, thus asking, what is television and what is the sitcom if not realms of repetition and variation? In this vein, repetition and variation go hand in hand. While stock social situations, jokes and narrative conventions such as happy endings are certainly repeated over and over again, the sitcom is an inherently flexible genre, able to encompass the specifics of international cultural contexts, for instance, and able to offer a transient social commentary on issues relating to class, gender, and socio-political attitudes. Moreover, routine and repetition in terms of programming and program scheduling enable sitcoms, and of course TV series in particular, to build a large and loyal audience that looked forward to the pleasures delivered by the program. In contrast to quality drama series, TV comedy has been repeatedly considered as a low cultural form, being snobbishly castigated by the cultural elites since it seems to cater for a popular audience and relies heavily on serialization and repetition rather than on experimentation and artistic originality. This seems to be a particular case in British situational comedy, as the format has been seen as excessively stereotypical and thus banal or trivial, as well as conservative and somewhat tasteless. Moreover, Birgit Neumann and Jürgen Kamm argue that sitcoms and other comedy formats inevitably return to familiar situations and re-establish the status quo at the end of each episode, often refuting possibilities of change and instead embracing continuation and sometimes even harmony and consensus instead. The somewhat repetitive nature, at times featuring characters who repeatedly move through the same scenarios and keep making the same mistakes, or a narrow set of continuously repeated jokes, creates significant predictability as to the actions, choices and future of the characters, both within the series and of course across the genre. As such, the format has been, due to its domesticity, its middle-class focus, its repetition of situations, characters and predictable narrative twists and turns, criticized as a form in which it is impossible to bring in new work, rendering the sitcom not only one of the most stable genres, but also one of the most conventional forms in British television. Yet, of course, the distinct factors of the sitcom, that is, the humour, the domesticity and the repetition, might actually be the very reason why the sitcom needs to be examined closer. First of all, sitcoms and the comic potential that is inherent in the genre enables the portrayal of the grotesque, the abject, and the unwatchable. By using and negotiating dominant cultural assumptions and commonplaces, comedy can thus have a subversive aspect in that it may further inclusion by challenging socially sanctioned power relationships, thus bringing the margin to the center, making it visible and giving it voice. Its potential to criticize social norms, unsettle hierarchies, and depict the unsayable has, as Susan Liddy formulates, has led to comedy being the genre in which transgressive characters are represented, suggesting that their intrinsic unwatchability may be overcome by couching and delivering it in a comedic form. Humor in this vein is a particular and unique type of communication, which would be impossible outside of the framework of the sitcom and by an extent outside of the domestic sphere. A type of communication that helps to dismantle negative and positive stereotypes, as it involves a temporary suspension of everyday norms and anarchically subverts established boundaries, thereby unsettling power structures, often making them visible in the first place. Others have argued that humor can be seen as a play with the institutionalized, traditional, and differentiated values and norms of a given society. In this way, the sitcom is able to playfully reshuffle the components of the surrounding socio-cultural, moral, and socio-political norms, turning the established order of opposites such as healthy and sick, acceptable and unacceptable around, and thus inverting traditional hierarchies which all too often lead to the marginalization of those not conforming to social norms. As Liddy's argument suggests, humor seems to be one of the facilitating factors in the depiction of more varied representations of life. Yet humor and comedy cannot be seen as the only contributing factors that render sitcoms worthwhile works for study. In his work, The Sitcom, Brett Mills examines the genre itself from multiple standpoints. However, in the following, two facets will be highlighted which add to the sitcom's potential to communicate controversial or uncomfortable topics, namely that it is inherently small time, focusing on the domestic and recognizable stock social situations, and that it is a site for negotiation, as it retains a potential for stabilization and destabilization in that it stresses circularity and repetition, usually over a long period of time with recognizable, recurring characters. The sitcom, just as the medium of which it is part, is ordinary, yet the sitcom also constitutes an intersection. On the one hand, the sitcom's domestic focus has ideological implications. Being a domestic medium made for the domestic sphere and consumed therein, it has been unsurprising that it has tried to replicate the experiences of its audience, and has thus often portrayed a largely middle-class domesticity, a portrayal that has been critiqued as disturbingly traditional. Moreover, placing the home at the forefront of the sitcom and opening it up to laughter has had multiple implications for the social roles which characters are cast in, and for women this places significant limits on the comic possibilities that are open to them. As such, the sitcom has helped to reaffirm, reinforce, and culturally legitimize dominant discourses by circulating centralized ideas of largely middle-class domesticity. Yet on the other hand, sitcoms are part of a capillary function of power, meaning that they also allow power to migrate from the margins of society to the center, like blood returning to the heart. Whereas the home is still the center stage, changing ideals and changing discourses necessitate a change in sitcom narratives in order to adequately replicate the lived realities and experiences of its audience. That does not mean at all that experiences can be adequately represented in the first place. Moreover, sitcoms usually draw large, diverse and unconnected audiences whose watching habits may influence the continuance of a program and might influence the content that is broadcast in the first place. Thus, potentially subversive portrayals are nonetheless rendered palatable for such audiences by, for instance, introducing transgressive ideas by the help of secondary characters, or by only briefly examining and working through alternatives in one episode before returning to the status quo at the end of the episode. By doing so, the narratives the sitcom represents may, the more often they're visually represented and circulated throughout society, become realities which, through time, are taken for granted as natural and as inevitable. Moreover, the sitcom is an aesthetically and culturally flexible genre which has become, due to new modes of production and storytelling, open to hybridization. As such, traditional sitcoms have started to, for instance, include off-location shots, overarching multi-episode narratives, crossover narratives, or more variations of domestic spaces by, for instance, contrasting multiple homes and the ideals that they are representative of with one another. It is this flexibility and immediacy that has enabled sitcoms to examine broader and more radical issues, thus providing a counterpoint to dominant power hierarchies. As such, the sitcom allots both dominant and subversive discourses visual space on the small screen. As the sitcom is mostly made for and consumed in the domestic sphere, this consideration has had repercussions for the actors involved in the sitcom. Film stars are usually internationally and nationally acclaimed and marked as special on the basis of their talent, but also because they are more attractive, more interesting, more exciting than us. The pleasures we get from them is access to a world beyond our own, which combines the spectacular with the everyday. This is not always the case for television actors. While that has changed in recent years, traditionally for the sitcom, star appeal may actually hamper building a special relationship with the viewer, a relationship that is both necessary from a comedy standpoint. After all, the successful comedy depends on the joking relationship between audience and joke teller, and necessary for the purpose of communicating a broad range of topics to the audience. Television actors are therefore portrayed to be just like us, as normal, everyday and average as their intended potential viewer, in order to build a special relationship between a character and the audience. A relationship which may, due to viewers being potentially exposed to the same characters over a long span of time, become so close that some television characters are actually seen to be part of the family. And this small-timeness that is inherent to the sitcom and the familiarity with the characters helps to produce a framework of intimacy and trust over the course of a series, or in fact the course of multiple series, which renders dealing with problematic topics more easily acceptable and may help audiences to adapt differently to alternative, contested, or disputed representations. Combining the focus on circularity, recognizability, and repetition, both in terms of character and in terms of setting, the subversive potential of comedic scripts, as well as the emphasis on the domestic, it may be argued that sitcoms, on the one hand, open up communicative possibilities in that they occupy a social and domestic role unavailable to most other media, and on the other hand, that sitcoms help to provide various possibilities of becoming to its audiences. Or more broadly, ja, reden bist du aber schon können. Regards to age, sexuality, gender, war, terror, and so on, Francis Boner has argued, Bonner, not Boner. What? Yeah, I think I was a bit distracted by sexuality, and then I said Boner instead of Bonner. Oh God.
The following day.
Important issues. Francis Boner. Nein! Again, her name is Bonner. God damn it. Oh, fuck. I actually took out sexuality and then I say that again? What? Visible and visual. Na genau. Domestic. Warum mache ich das so komisch?